Hi, and welcome to Commonwealth Wine School's webinar on Introduction to Sake. My name is Marina Giordano. I am one of the educators at Commonwealth Wine School. Glad to have you here today. Today we're going to talk about sake. I am a wine and sake educator. I have my diploma in wine and spirits with WSET, and I also have my sake diploma with the Japanese Sommelier Association. I have a number of other wine and sake certifications, but I think those are the most important. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about sake. We teach 3 levels of the WSET sake course at Commonwealth. We have level 1, which is an introduction to sake. We have the brand new level 2, which we're super excited to have brought on. It really has bridged the gap between our introductory course of level 1 and our level 3, which is much more advanced and really in depth. So the level 2 is a great opportunity for people who know a little bit about sake to learn more without taking that first deep dive into the level 3, which goes really in depth into all of the ingredients and processes of sake. So today, like I said, I'll give you kind of like an overview. We'll talk a lot of what we're talking about we cover in level 1. I'll probably touch on a couple things that come out of level 2, and depending, I may hit a couple things that happen in level 3, but we won't get too in depth with that stuff. So first of all, what is sake? Sake is an alcohol beverage made from rice. There are 4 ingredients in sake: rice, water, yeast, and koji. Koji is molded rice that helps to break the starches into sugars, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. There's one optional ingredient in sake also, and that is high-strength distilled alcohol. We talk primarily about premium sake in the WSET classes, and so this addition of alcohol isn't a bad thing. It's not done to stretch the product or to make it more cost effective. It's done to enhance aromas and flavors. So in premium sake, it's really not a bad thing. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So let's backtrack back to talking about what these ingredients are. So our base ingredient, sake, must be made from rice. It can be made from table rice and often is, but it is also made from sake-specific rice. So these are rices that are grown specifically to brew sake. The difference between table rice and sake-specific rice is sake-specific rice has a concentration of starches in the center of the grain. They tend to have lower protein content. There's a number of other things that happen with sake rice, but the primary one is that there's a concentration of starch in the middle. So it can be made with sake-specific rice or table rice. And what they're going to do is polish the rice grains. The rice grains that are used have a concentration of starch in the middle, and the outer portion is proteins, vitamins, minerals, lipids, amino acids, and those things can create acidity and umami in sake. And if we get it primarily to starch, then we're going to get fruity and floral flavors, less cereal, less lactic. So we have our rice, water. About 80% of sake is water, and water is used in every step of the production process, from watering the rice that's growing in the fields to washing the rice and steaming it, to additions during production, and even cleaning up the brewery. So it's used through the whole process. Typically, they're going to use a local source of water. Most breweries were built near an excellent source of water, but brewers can use tap water, and they can filter and alter it to how they want it to go through the brewing process. So it's water. Our next ingredient would be yeast. Yeast is the microorganism that turns the sugars into alcohol. So we use yeast in wine production and beer production, and it is the same type of yeast. It's just different strains that can brew at colder temperatures and to higher alcohol levels. So that will convert our sugars into alcohol. And then importantly is koji. So as I said earlier, rice is made with starches. Starches are chains of sugars, and in order to access the sugars that are in the starches, we need something to break it down for the yeast. So koji koji kin or koji mold will be grown on rice, creating koji. Koji is the molded rice. And this provides the enzymes that'll break those starches into sugars. So those long chains of sugars that comprise the starch, the enzymes will act on those and break it into small pieces, and then the yeast can consume them and produce the alcohol. I also mentioned there's that one additional ingredient of high-strength distilled alcohol, which is optional. A brewer may use this to enhance the aromas and to dry out the finish of the sake. But again, it's an optional ingredient, and if a sake has the word jumai on it, whether it's the grade jumai or it says jumai ginjo or jumai daiginjo, it does not have any added alcohol. Again, not a bad thing, but just a part of the process. So those are ingredients. Once we have harvested our rice, we will begin the production process for sake. So I'm going to walk through that a little bit. I should have mentioned also that sake is not a spirit. It's often confused. People think that sake is really high in alcohol and it's distilled like a spirit, like vodka or rum. It is not distilled. It is brewed or fermented like a beer or a wine. And the alcohol level is typically about 15 to 17%. So it's about at the high end of wine and obviously more than beer. Beers are typically much lower, but it's not the strength of a spirit. So it's one of the things to keep in mind. So what happens in our sake production is after harvesting the rice, they're going to polish it. And I'm actually going to share a slide with you because this will make it a little bit easier to understand what's happening in the process of our grades and how we're creating different flavor and aroma profiles in sake. So let me show you this. So first of all, here's our rice grain. So as I mentioned earlier, the sake specific rices have a concentration of starch in the center, and that's this middle part called the shimpaku, and it's almost purely starch. And then the outer portion, this grayish area, has those proteins, lipids, vitamins, and minerals, and that creates more cereal, lactic, umami, acid flavors. So the brewer is going to choose to mill some of that outer portion of the rice grain away. And that's what's going to determine our grade of sake. So not to get too confusing, but I just wanted to give you a little overview of this because this is how the taste profile that the brewer is creating, this is going to be one of the factors that's really going to be important in deciding what the end sake tastes like. So on the left-hand side of this diagram is a full grain of rice, and that can be used in jumai. It's not typical to use that much of the rice grain. They typically mill it to 70%, which is 70% of the rice grain remaining. That means 30% has been removed. And when we're at that level, we're going to get more cereal and lactic flavors and aromas. So for jumai and hanjoso, they would typically be at this percent, at 70%. Hanjoso has to be a minimum of 70. Jumai could be higher. Then once we get down to 60 and 50%, this is where we're getting more pure fruit, floral aromas and flavors because we're getting almost all starch that we're using in the brewing process. And in order to be called ginjo or jumai ginjo, it has to be milled to at least 60% and then 50% or less for daiginjo and jumai ginjo. So these are governed by Japanese law, and these are minimums that the brewers need to meet, but this is one of the things that helps to create that final taste profile in sake. So they will mill the rice, or they'll have it milled and it gets shipped in that way. After polishing the rice, they will wash it. The washing is going to remove that powder. Then they're going to soak it. It's going to adjust the moisture content and prepare the rice for fermentation and for steaming. They'll steam the rice, and then we're ready for production. So about a quarter of that steamed rice will go into Koji production, and then the rest of the rice will be for building our starter and building our main fermentation. So as we send some of the rice out to Koji production, this process will take 2 days, and this is where the brewer will grow the mold on a batch of rice. Again, that mold provides the enzyme that's going to break the starches into sugars. So it's really important. Without Koji, we wouldn't have sake. So they'll take the rice into a separate area, a separate room in the brewery, and it's heat and humidity controlled. It's higher in heat, higher in humidity. And they're going to spread the rice out on the table, sprinkle mold over it, wrap it up. Every 90 minutes or so, they're going to unwrap it and knead it and spread it out over the table, ensuring they have even growth and breaking up hot spots. This whole process will take 2 days. At about halfway through, they're going to kind of separate it into smaller portions and really control the mold growth. So after these 2 days, we've got our Koji mold, and we can really begin the rest of our production process. So we'll start with a smaller starter fermentation. And the point of doing this smaller tank is to really build up the yeast population. Sake has much lower acids than wine, so it can easily be spoiled. So we want to make sure that our microorganism, the yeast that we're using to convert the sugars into alcohol, is the predominant microorganism. We don't want other things infecting the batch. So we'll start with a small tank, and we'll put our rice, our water, our yeast, and our koji into that tank. And we'll start the production process. This will take about 2 weeks. There's some other methods, traditional methods that take longer and that add complexity and acidity to our sake. But in most cases, it'll just be the 2-week process, this faster starter fermentation. At the end of 2 weeks, the brewer will take that starter batch and they'll put it into the main fermentation tank. And to that, we'll add more of our ingredients over a couple days. And this is going to allow the yeast population to stay really strong without being diluted. So we'll add ingredients slowly over a couple days, building our main batch. So we start with our starter, adding more water, more koji, and more steamed rice. Once those are all combined, then our brewing process starts, and we do our fermentation, and it can take anywhere from 21 to 35 days, depending on the style of sake that we're making, whether we're making ginjo style or we're making a rich jumai style. Rich jumai will be faster. It's a faster, warmer fermentation. Ginjo will be a colder, much slower fermentation. It'll naturally ferment to somewhere between 17 and 20% alcohol. At that point, we need to separate the rices from the rice solids that are left, because not all of the rice will dissolve in the fermentation process. We'll need to separate those from the liquid in order to get our clear sake. Before that, we might add some of that high-strength distilled alcohol that I mentioned earlier for our hanjoso, our ginjo, or our daiginjo. The addition of this alcohol before filtration will enhance aromas. It'll also give a drier finish to the sake. That's an optional ingredient, does not need to be added. In futsushu or table sake, it would be added to stretch the product to make it more cost effective. But in premium sake, we're just adding it to increase the aromas. The sake will then be filtered or pressed. It must pass through a filtration device in order to be called sake by Japanese law. There's a couple different methods of doing this. The most common is using air panels that press against like mesh, and the sake solids will stick to those mesh panels and the liquid will pass through. After filtration, in most cases, we're going to dilute it with a little bit of water. So there'll be some water addition, bringing the alcohol percent down, maybe 1-2%. This helps to balance out the flavors of the sake, helps to perhaps make it a little bit more palatable with food. After we've made a little bit of a water addition, then we're going to need to package it and bottle it. At that point, we have the option to also pasteurize. So pasteurization is rapid heating and cooling, just like we do with dairy products. What this does with sake is it stops the enzyme action of the koji, making the sake shelf stable. If we don't pasteurize it, that is called namazake, and we need to keep those refrigerated. If we pasteurize it, it's much more shelf stable, will last a little bit longer, and doesn't need to be in the refrigerator. Although I recommend you keep your sake refrigerated, it will just last longer regardless. Most sakes will be pasteurized twice. It also mutes the flavors and aromas of sake. So namazake is very pronounced, very bold in flavors and much more pronounced aroma. So we'll pasteurize and then we bottle. Might go into bottle, might go into cups or cans, maybe a carton. Remember that sake bottles are actually a 720 milliliter. So bottles of wine are typically a 750, so it's a little bit less in a sake bottle. And actually in Japan, you most often will see it in what we call ishubin, which is the 1.8 liter bottles. Here in the US, we tend to get a lot of the smaller bottles, the 300 milliliters. Cups and cans tend to be what we get here in the US. So that's our whole production process for sake. It'll also sit, once it's been bottled, it'll be set to storage for maybe 3 to 6 months. And that just allows the integration of flavors, kind of allows them to just meld together a little bit better and taste better when it gets out to you. One of the things that we need to keep in mind when we buy sake is we don't want to cellar it. We don't want to hold on to it. Buy a sake that's like, oh, when my kid graduates from college, I'm going to give this the bottle that I've aged for 15 years. You don't want to cellar it like we do with wines. You really want to taste it soon after you've purchased it, soon after production of sake. That's really the way that the brewer intends it to taste, is when it's first released. You can age sake, some people do, but if you want that flavor, you're probably better to buy what we call aged sake, which is koshu. Those are sakes that were specifically brewed to be aged. So there are aged sakes out there, but in most cases, you want to taste your sake fairly soon after you've purchased it. The good thing about sake, though, unlike wine, once a bottle of wine is open, you really want to consume it within a couple days. With sake, it will stay open, it'll stay stable once it's open much longer than wine. It doesn't oxidize the same way. So what I recommend is when you buy your sake, bring it home and put it right in the refrigerator. If you have a wine fridge, put it in there. If you don't have space in your refrigerator, keep it in a cool, dry space. But once you've opened it, you want to make sure you cap it again and put it back in the refrigerator, and it should last for 2 to 3 weeks. A Jumai or Hanjoso or even Futsushu or sakes that are higher in acidity will last even longer. Our daiginjos, you might want to consume them within about 2 weeks, but most sake will last at least 3 weeks, if not a little bit longer. One thing that I should have mentioned back when I was talking about production, so we talked about filtration, where we're separating those solids from the liquids. By law, it must pass through a filtration device, but you may have heard of what we call unfiltered sakes, nigori sake. Nigori actually translates to cloudy, and these sakes have rice particles remaining in them. They have been filtered, though. They're just filtered with a coarse mesh that allows some of those rice particles to pass through, creating that cloudy appearance. So those have been filtered. It's not really unfiltered sake. Let's see, there's other specialty sakes, especially that we talk about in the different levels of our WSET sake. We have nigori, I mentioned nama, which is unpasteurized, koshu, which is aged sake, taru sake, which is sake that's aged in wood, and we have kijoshu sake too, which is sweet sake. So those are some of the specialty sakes that we talk about. We talk about production processes for them and what they taste like. Other things. So everybody thinks I need to drink my sake hot, right? You don't need to heat your sake. And in most cases, especially with premium sake, we want to taste it cold. We want to drink it cold. So what I recommend is you put it in the refrigerator, treat it just like you would a white wine. Put it in the refrigerator. Maybe when you're cooking, you take it out and you pour yourself a glass to enjoy while you're cooking, and it starts to warm up. Or even as you're eating, when you have it table side, just let it kind of warm up a little bit. And we'll sort of get to what I like to call that magic sort of temperature where it's like, oh, this tastes fantastic right now. You may find it starts to get a little heavy, a little almost syrupy, especially if it's a daiginjo or ginjo, and put it back in the refrigerator or put it on ice. If it's a jumai or hanjoso, it might taste better once it gets closer to like room temperature. Or if you're tasting astringency in the sake or bitterness, let it warm up a little bit. If once it's at room temperature, you still feel like still doesn't quite taste right to me, you might want to try heating it then. You can do this simply by putting it in the microwave. Put it into a microwave-safe container and heat it up for 20 to 30 seconds. Taste it, see how it is. You can also do this more gently with a water bath. The easiest way to do a water bath is you heat a pan of water on the stovetop, remove that pan of water, and then take your sake. If it's a bottle, make sure it's opened because pressure will build as it heats. But put the bottle into the warm water or pour it into a carafe or some other, sometimes I just use like even a glass or something, and let it warm for a couple minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. And that'll bring the temperature up. It's perfect on a cold day. It's great to have warm sake. Summertime, I'd rather drink my chilled sakes. Sakes you wouldn't want to warm is nigori in most cases. You wouldn't want to warm that. Your daiginjos and ginjos, you typically don't want to warm. It's one of the things that we practice in class is showing you how to warm sake and how it changes from cold to warm. You wouldn't want to heat sparkling sake. That's one of the other specialty sakes. There are sparkling sakes out there, some that taste like fruit style champagne and some that taste like peach yogurt. So there's a full range of really sweet and really dry sakes, sparkling sakes. Those you wouldn't want to heat. Let's see. Oh, drinking vessels. Everybody thinks, oh, you're supposed to shoot sake, and so we have to serve it in shot glasses. The actual reason that sake is served in shot glasses isn't because it's a spirit, not because they want you to shoot it. It's actually in Japan, you never pour for yourself. You always pour for others and they pour for you. It's a sign of respect. It's a sign of friendship. So if we use small cups, then we have to pour for each other a lot. So it's just continues to show how much I honor, appreciate you. I honor our friendship by having to pour constantly for each other. So what I recommend is most sakes, especially your ginjos, daiginjo, you want to serve in a wine glass. Serve it just like you would chilled slightly in a wine glass. You can also serve your jumai and hanjoso that way. If you have some decorative ochoko or the cups that we use for sake, those are great. And especially if you're doing warm sake, you'd probably want to put it in ceramics and porcelain, something that'll maintain the heat a little bit better than a glass. A glass will be, you'll lose your heat really quickly. But so I recommend just using wine glasses, regular wine glasses. Pairing sake. So don't just drink it with your Japanese food. Don't just have it with sushi. It actually pairs really well with all kinds of foods. It's much lower in acids than wine is. It has about 5 times the amount of umami as wine, which helps for pairing. It comes in and just supports the food. It really doesn't, there's actually a Japanese phrase, sake never fights with food, and it really doesn't. It doesn't compete with the foods. So think outside of the box. Think about the weight of your sake with the weight of your food. So if you're having rich, heavy type of food, like one of my favorites is like meatballs and spaghetti sauce paired with sake. So use a rich sake, a rich jumai style, something that has more weight to it. Hamburger, loaded hamburger, fantastic with a namazake. Barbecue, steak, or like pulled pork or something like that. Fantastic with sake. Pizza, pepperoni pizza. It pairs with the cheese and the bread. It just goes really well. One of my favorites though is brunch, is to have daiginjo with brunch. It goes really well with egg and with cheese. It pairs really well with bacon, with the salt from bacon. It even goes well with fruit. There's a little bit of sugar in sake, making it slightly sweet for wine drinkers, especially. Excuse me. So that tends to pair well with the sugars in the fruits, and then it's lower acid, so you don't have the competing acid of the fruit too. So I suggest just trying it with everything. It's a fantastic beverage and goes really well with everything. So just think about the weight of the food and the weight of the sake. How big and rich is the sake, and try to match things up that way. And we do talk about pairing in class. We talk about thinking. We do this in our basic wine classes too, looking at how the different food components like acid and umami will pair with different components. So here's a question that's coming in. Is there a way to know which sakes are sweet and which are dry when I'm looking at a label in a wine store? There is, we'll call it a rough guideline, I guess. There is something on the sake label called the SMV, or the sake meter value. And this is it's the specific gravity of sake in water. It's like the density of sake in water. So it can be a rough indicator of how sweet or dry a sake is. The higher the number, the drier. It's not a 0-point scale, so it's a little touch and go. And there's other things that go into how sweet or dry a sake might be. But when you look at that number, higher is drier. So positive numbers, like typically you would find 2, 3, 6. 6 is pushing it. 7 maybe. 24 is the highest, driest I've ever had. But then there's minus some numbers. So -3, -4, those will be fairly sweet. And then as low as -90 is like the lowest number I've had. So that can be a rough guideline. Sometimes they're getting better about putting an English description, saying this is a dry style sake. That's the easiest way to figure it out if the salesperson at the store isn't knowledgeable in sake. So looking at the SMV, sake meter value, would be a good way to do that. Let's see. Here's another question, which I touched on a little bit earlier, but maybe they missed it. Should I age my sake? So no, you don't want to cellar and hold on to your sakes. You really want to taste them. There's often a production date on the sake, and you want to taste them within about a year or two of the production date. Holding on to them, the amino acids begin to break down. They get a little bit sherry, become like sherry-ish, or sometimes if they're not aging well, they get like pickled vegetables. Sometimes they just taste stale. You can tell if a sake is off by color often. It'll be a deeper yellow. Most sakes will be like clear water white. They'll look like water, or maybe just a hint of color, much lighter than even a white wine. So when they start to look more like a Chardonnay, they're probably off a little bit. They've been stored for too long. Another thing is you want to keep your sake away from light. It's very susceptible to light damage, whether it's natural light or artificial light. So if you buy a sake and it comes in a box, keep it in the box. If it comes with, sometimes they have a plastic wrap around them, or something that looks a little, like I would call it sort of musliny. It's usually a little bit thinner than that. Looks like a filter. Those are actually UV protection for the bottle. So leave that on and store it that way. That's why sake bottles are colored. Brown bottles provide a lot of light protection, but you'll often see them brown, blue, even pink, green. That provides light protection for the sake. So leave them in a box, keep them in a dark place. It'll last a lot longer. Another great question, what is the most polished? So I talked about the polishing ratios. So how much they're polishing the rice grain to get it down to primarily starch. So at daiginjo level, we're taking away half of the rice grain at the minimum, but those are minimums. So they could mill it even further than that. So you'll often see a daiginjo that's 35, 30, maybe 23, like a company called Dasai brews their sakes. They make a 23, a 39, and a 45. So there's a milling ratios. The actual lowest that a sake rice has been milled to create sake is actually 0, which I know seems really strange. They can round down. So it's actually 0.66% is the semi-bue, or the polishing ratio. I've not tried that sake. It's very expensive. The furthest I've tasted is the size beyond, which is somewhere between, they don't disclose it, 12 and 15%. And I don't know if I tasted it side by side, maybe I would have noticed a difference, but I don't know that it's a lot different. It's just very pure, refined flavors. So yeah, they can mill really far. It's not common. It's kind of a part of competition. Sake is really why they do that. Let's see if there's okay. All right. Let's see what else. Oh, are there sake brewers in the US? Yes, there are actually. We have, if you're from Massachusetts, we have one right here in Massachusetts, and Farthest Star Sake Brewery. But there are a number of brewers around the US, small craft brewers, everywhere from, there's a couple in New York, there's a couple in Brooklyn, there, North Carolina, Arkansas, Minnesota, Colorado, Texas. There's a couple in California, San Diego, San Francisco, Oakland, California. And then there's large producers too. Some of the Japanese brewers have locations here in the US, where they have larger breweries. A lot of those are in California. So yep, there are definitely sake brewers in the United States. There's a number out in European countries. I know there's Italy, there's England, there's Australia and New Zealand. So there's quite a few like little craft breweries outside of Japan even. And in Japan, there's just over 1,000 brewers, about 1,200 at this point. The numbers have dropped off since like the 90s. The numbers have continually dropped, and we're losing brewers in Japan. So really important to get out there and buy and drink your sake. Let's see if there's, oh, another question. Great. How many, so I talked about rices. There's sake specific rices and there's table rices that sake can be made from. So the sake specific rices, how many sake specific rices are there? There's over 100, there's about 112, I believe it is at this point, excuse me, registered sake specific rices. Sake specific rice is typically twice as much in cost to purchase as table rice. And it's much more difficult to grow. It falls over easily, it's taller, so it's harder to grow, which makes it more expensive. And then the most popular sake specific rice is called Yamada Nishiki. It's called the king of rice because it's great for brewing ginjo style sakes. It has a large shimpaku, it has that large concentration of starch in the middle, has a large grain, it makes it easy to polish to daiginjo levels. Yamada Nishiki can cost 5 times as much as table rice. And it is used often for everything from daiginjos to even futsushu or cup sakes. Here's another question. Oh, never had sake before, and so what sake should I start with? That's an interesting question. I would say, if you've never had sake before, I think I would start with a cup sake. Cup sakes, I actually have one here. So this is Johto's 1 cup sake. I think I'd start with like a cup sake. So these are typically 200 milliliters. Sometimes they're in, this is sort of like a, it's just a cup. It's like a cardboard cup. Sometimes they're in glass cups. Sometimes they're in cans. So they're only 200 milliliters. So what I like to say to people, because often, you know, sake looks more expensive than wine. As I said, once it's opened, it lasts a lot longer. So you're actually getting more for your money. You can keep using it. You don't have to put it in your sauce when you're cooking. You'll actually be able to still drink it. But this is not a commitment. It's 200 milliliters. If you don't like it, dump it out. So if you buy a couple different grades, so actually let me go back to the grade screen so I can just show you this. So when we look at the grades, actually I have one more slide here that shows here. This is better. So these styles at the top of this grid, Jumai Daiginjo, Daiginjo, Jumai Ginjo, and Ginjo tend to have fruity and floral flavors and aromas. They tend to be lower in acidity and lower in umami. So if you look for those on the label for fruity characteristics. So I think what I do is I'd buy a cup sake that says Ginjo, Daiginjo, or Jumai Ginjo, Jumai Daiginjo, somewhere on the label. And then I would find one that says just Jumai or just Hanjoso. And if it doesn't have the grade at all, then it's probably futsushu. And I think I would try that. Like, so compare how that tastes, the cereal lactic taste profile compared to the Ginjo style. And then when you go back to the store, like, oh, I really enjoyed that Jumai style better than the Daiginjo. And so then find Jumai sakes or find Hanjosos. Those will be a similar taste profile. or if you preferred the fruity style, ginjo, look for the word ginjo on the label. Those tend to be more wine-like, more with fruity floral flavors, and lower in acidity. So it kind of depends too, if you're just a sipper, if you like to just drink your alcohol beverages and you're not eating. If you're eating, I would recommend using like a Jumai or Hanjoso. But a great question. One of the things that we learn in class too is, we talk about these grades and styles, but we also go over some of the Japanese kanji, which are the Japanese characters of the language, so that you can identify them on a bottle or on a cup, and you can have an idea of what might be like in the bottle. Of course, most sakes that are imported into the US have an English label. They will have an English label, and they'll often have a description. So they'll tell you what grade it is at minimum, and then typically they'll put on a description. They're getting much better at saying if they're sweet or dry, if they're cereal style, or if they have, flavors of banana, apple, melon, stuff like that. So getting much better at that. Let's see, I'm not sure if there's any other questions out there. I want to take a look through to see what I may have missed in my notes. The classes that we have upcoming, we have a level 1 on October 5th, and that's a one-day intensive. We typically do our classes as intensives, but we also have, so we have one-day intensive on October 5th at Commonwealth, but we also offer every month online. There's a new level 1 that starts, and that's self-guided. You go through the program at your pace, and then we have one live webinar where I walk you through the most important parts of the course, answer the questions, and we do a tasting together, so that you can understand what sake tastes like, and walking through the SAT, the systematic approach to tasting with that WSET uses. We have a level 2, the brand new level 2. We've run one class of this so far, and like I said earlier, we're super excited to bring it on because it really bridges that gap between our level 1 and our level 3. If you know something about sake, it would be better to start in there. If you know that sake is made from rice, if you have an idea what the grades are, you don't need to know exactly every parameter around it, but if you understand them, then level 2 is probably a better place to start. That we have an intensive for that November 22nd, 23rd, and 24th. It's a half day on the 22nd, which is a Friday. And then if you already know stuff about sake and you just want to learn more and you want to learn everything you could possibly know about sake, we have our level 3, which we offer as a hybrid this time around. We will have it again as a weekly class, but for the fall, it's what we call hybrid. So we do Zoom sessions, and those start on October 9th. We have I think there's 6 sessions on Zoom, which are 3 hours at a time. And then we meet in person to review and to go over tasting. And then the test is the next day, where with level 3, you have a tasting exam and a theory exam. Oh, I know one of the questions that people ask all the time is, how many sakes will I taste in class? So in level 1, we taste about 12 sakes, and we taste each of the grades, and we taste specialty sakes. So you come out with a really good understanding of, like the question was, if I've never had sake before, how do I know where to start? This gives you a really good idea of what the grades taste like, and how to select maybe what you prefer. And then with level 2, we add a few more sakes. We add another specialty sake, and we start talking a little bit more about the ingredients. We mostly go a little bit more into production, getting a little bit deeper than the level 1. We taste about 15 to 16 sake at level 2. And then by the time you get to level 3, we taste almost 40 sake in the level 3 class. Tasting everything from grades, specialty, we taste for yeast, we taste for rices, we taste for starter process, and we have about 40 sakes. So when we do that hybrid class where we're on Zoom and we're in person, I give you a list of about 12 to 15 sakes to buy, to taste with me during Zoom sessions. And then when we come together, we round out the rest of it. Some of the stuff that's a little bit harder to get, I bring in and we taste, and I make sure you're tasting through what we're trying to teach. So yeah, you get a huge expanse of sake. and tasting all different kinds. Let's see if there's anything else I didn't cover. Actually, all right. So let's go back and talk a little bit about the specialty sake. So I mentioned nigori, which is cloudy sake. So those tend in taste profile to be typically more lactic in cereal taste, and they tend to be a little bit more simple because we're keeping those rice particles in the sake. So you can find daiginjo style, you can find ginjo style, but typically they're more cereal lactic flavors. They can be sweet, they can be dry, and they can be really thick, like almost where you're chewing the rice particles, and sometimes they're really thin where you can actually like see through them, see between the particles. So that's our nigori sake. The sparkling sake, there's a couple different methods of creating sparkling sake. So they could just like inject it with carbon dioxide. That's what creates the bubbles in it. The carbon dioxide will dissolve into the liquid, creating the bubbles. Or they can do secondary fermentation, just like we do with secondarily fermented wine, like champagne. So secondary bottle fermentation in the bottle or in a tank. And those tend to be a little bit more delicate bubbles than the injected. And sparkling sake can be anything from sweet to dry, low in alcohol with only 5 or 6%, up to 16, 17, even higher for the drier styles. For sparkling sakes, that would be one way to tell if they're dry or if they're sweet. If they have a lower alcohol level, they will be sweeter. If they have a higher alcohol level, they would be drier. Those are sparkling sakes. Koshu is aged sake, and that's where the brewer will brew a sake specifically for aging. Typically, it would be high in acidity and probably high in umami, but it doesn't have to be. They can age any grade, any style of sake. And they develop nutty flavors. They tend to get a darker appearance. The amino acids begin to break down, and that's what provides that darker color. They often are more pronounced in aromas, and the acidity is typically higher. They often taste kind of like an Oloroso sherry or a Fino sherry. Smell a little bit sweet and a little bit caramely, but the taste is often dry. That's koshu. Those pair really well with food. They have a higher acidity, they have umami. They just tend to go really well with food. And then kijoshu is another one of our specialty styles, and that's sweet sake. So these sakes were created to compete with the sweet wines like Sauterne. And so what they do is during the production process, they replace one of the water additions at the beginning when we're building our fermentation with already created sake. And that creates leftover sugars in the fermentation process. So those sakes stay sweet. And then they're often aged. So they have caramel flavors, nut, kind of like fruit cake sort of flavors. One that we taste often in class tastes like French onion soup. But like it's just crazy the level of umami and the interesting flavors that are created by adding this alcohol, adding the sake back in at the beginning and then aging it. It's really fantastic, fun kind of sake. And those are often aged. So the one I usually use in class is aged, I think it's 7 years after it's been produced. And just really fun and interesting. Great pairing with chocolate, with even one of the local restaurants here pairs it with foie gras with a little piece of dark chocolate on top, and it's amazing. Goes really good on like vanilla ice cream. So fun. So excellent. So, okay, if there's any other questions, I don't see anything else coming in. So I think we're going to wrap this up. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about sake. If you have questions, you can always reach out to info@Commonwealth Wine School or to me, Marina. My email is winesakechick@outlook.com, or you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook. I'm on there all the time, and I'd be happy to answer any sake questions. But best of all, I would love to see you in class, whether it's one of our WSET classes. Watch for, we'll be adding some fun, like 1.5 to 2 hour classes. Like hopefully we got a sake and chocolate coming up, but we'll do a sake 101, and then some sake classes are focused in on maybe more of an ingredient like yeast or rices and stuff like that. So I hope to see you in class sometime and get out there and try some sake, please. Bye everyone, thank you.